Salutations, I am the Vengeful Vadim, and I'm here with a brand new installment of my Halo beta series. This time we'll be looking into the production of Halo 3 and its phases of development. From the scraps of footage I can gather as well as gameplay for myself, we'll be analyzing what we can from footage and screenshots of the pre-alpha, the numerous alpha builds, the public beta, and finally, the Epsilon. As many of you are aware, the development of Halo 3 was nowhere near as chaotic and disastrous as Halo 2's. While certain pieces of content would still be cut from the final release of Halo 3, most of what Bungie wanted to accomplish with this title was able to come to fruition on launch. This is a stark contrast to what happened with Halo 2, where Bungie's over-ambition led to the entire graphics engine having to be scrapped due to hardware limitations with the original Xbox, as well as many campaign levels having to be cut due to time constraints. Due to a more refined development process, this will mean that, unlike the Halo 2 beta, the differences between the older builds of Halo 3 and the final game won't be anywhere near as obvious in terms of visuals and gameplay. However, there are still plenty of differences that can be seen in the game's pre-release build under enough scrutiny. First, we'll start off with the pre-alpha stage of Halo 3's development. With the limited amount of actual gameplay footage that we have in the pre-alpha stages of Halo 3, there's not too much to actually dissect apart from the obvious graphical differences. When viewing the documentary Et tu Brute, there will be instances of the video where several TVs can be seen with the game loaded up. At this point in Halo 3's development, there was a plethora of placeholder content that was carried over or inspired by Halo 2. This frame right here gives us the clearest picture as to what the HUD looked like in this stage of Halo 3's development. It's very similar to what we have with Halo 2's HUD, using the same art style for the icons, such as the ones for the weapon icon and the grenades. One notable change to the HUD compared to the one seen in both Halos 2 and 3 is where the shield bar is located. This time it's on the upper right hand corner right next to the weapon icon and ammo counter. In another frame in the same segment of the video, the visor zoom is more akin to Halo 2's zoom than the one we have in Halo 3. The animations for the assault rifle are using the battle rifle animations from Halo 2, and the shotgun and SMG are using their Halo 2 counterparts animations as well. Also in the shot with the SMG, this brute's holding an untextured weapon, more on this later. The gravity hammer still uses Tartarus' fixed of Rucht model that was prominent in Halo 2's campaign, and finally in this shot, the plasma turret's using the plasma cannon model from Halo 2. The differences go beyond weapons though. A red variant of the Brute Captain was originally supposed to appear in the final game, but was scrapped. Chieftains were at one point going to wield energy swords, but it never made it into the final game, which is good because the elites should only be the one using the swords. Aside from the obvious graphical differences, this section of an earlier version of Savo Highway has a crashed Pelican with a Warthog flip over outside, as well as the appearance of barricades and a steep, hilly incline. There is no encounter with this exact configuration of details anywhere in the Savo Highway mission. After analyzing some of the shots in the encounter that are available in the VidOg, I hypothesized that this location was eventually split into two different encounters entirely. We now have one where you meet the choppers for the first time and destroy the first shield gate, and another encounter where you cross the broken highway on foot and fight off against two waves of enemies coming out of Phantoms. The terrain in the chopper encounter was changed to allow for more flexibility with vehicular combat by removing most of the incline, the barriers, and the crashed Pelican. The incline and barriers that were there before were moved to the very next encounter with the Phantoms to give the player and the Marine allies more cover. Moving on for the pre-alpha stage of Halo 3 is of course the alpha, and there's actually a couple of different alpha builds that can be seen. We'll start with what we can gather from the famous Pimps at Sea build. For those who don't know about Pimps at Sea in general, it's an April Fool's Day joke Bungie made that centered around a fake action/RTS game they were quote-unquote developing, where the player is this badass combination of a pimp and a pirate. What this has to do with Halo 3 is that a certain alpha build of this game was codenamed Pimps at Sea when it was playtested over Xbox Live to prevent the general public from knowing what they were actually playing. This build was actually given to US soldiers at the beginning of 2007, and it was only a matter of time until leaked footage popped up on the web. We don't have much to go off of with this particular build of the game, but we can still gather some information from what we have. At this point in the game's development, most of the weapons were still using placeholder animations from Halo 2. Example of this is the assault rifle and battle rifle using animations from the Halo 2 battle rifle as opposed to their Halo 3 counterparts. The same applies for the Magnum, the Sniper, and it appears the Spiker were using different animations as well compared to what the final version looks like. The last bit of information that we can gather from these two videos is what the searching for game screen looks like, and it actually doesn't look too different from what we have in the final game, with the differences being that it's nowhere near as detailed. It also has a much larger preview picture of the selected map, but there doesn't seem to be an option to veto the level like you could in the beta and onward. Well, that's all we can gather from footage. A Reddit user named SneakyFellow managed to acquire the Pimps at Sea build way back in January of 2007 by having one of his friends download it from a Microsoft employee's download history. When he had access to the alpha, he took screenshots of what he saw and the picture quality is actually much better than what we have with the shaky camera footage from the videos before, which means we can further analyze the differences seen in this build. The main menu didn't have a blue filter turned on like in the final game, and only had matchmaking and custom games as selectable options. This picture here is the clearest one. The HUD overall resembles that of the final version much more closely, but it's not quite finished yet. In this shot of the game on Snowbound, there is no counter for firebomb grenades on the top left, only showing frag, plasma, and spike grenades as options. This is most likely due to the firebomb grenade not being implemented into Halo 3 just yet. Underneath the shield bar is a compass that goes unused in the final version of the game, but keep this feature in mind as it'll be important later on in the video. The weapon icon on the top right is facing the opposite direction compared to the final release. There's also a ghost that's nowhere near its final spawn location. It's unknown if whether or not the grenade actually spawned there in the alpha, or was discarded by another player in that current match. In another screenshot, we're able to notice that the weapon icon for a player's secondary weapon is placed on the left hand side of the screen underneath the grenades, rather than below the primary weapons icon on the right like in the final version. In this shot here, we can see that the visor binoculars are still more like the ones seen in Halo 2 than the final version of Halo 3. Here, we actually have a much clearer picture of the matchmaking screen for searching games. It's somewhat close to what we have in the final, but there's some obvious differences. The way that the game displays player skill when searching for a game is shown in a small graph, where it also redundantly shows how big your party is. The biggest surprise that can be found in this group of pictures, however, is this untextured rocket launcher-like weapon seen here. It's unknown as to what kind of weapon this turned out to be, or if it's even in the final game at all. It could be a prototype of the missile pod, while it also has a slight resemblance to the old anti-aircraft rocket launcher seen in the Macworld 99 build of Halo 1. There's one more video that shows an alpha build of Halo 3, and that's the Quiznum Proterodamnovidoc. I hope I said that right, shit. It was at this point in development that certain pieces of content were starting to take on their final forms. A lot of the weapons here, such as the assault rifle, now have their own animations that carried over to release. In this shot here of Valhalla, there's a number of broken tree trunks that don't carry over to the final version of this map. The video showcases an older version of the bubble shield, which took on a spherical shape much like the power drain and radar jammer. In this shape, it was capable of bringing the shield with itself as it rolled down a hill. In various shots of this video, there's a set of small TVs that are playing what appears to be an older build of Halo 3 compared to what the developers were testing at this time. The weapons in the video are still using the Halo 2 placeholder animations, and within this shot, we can see the energy sword and its Halo 2 animations being used, as well as the carbine. Now, it's finally time to move on to the public Halo 3 beta, a version of the game that I actually got the chance to revisit after playing it way back in 2007, and it just recently turned 10 years old. The entire main menu has been unlocked thanks to Lord Zedd's Unlocker, which means options such as campaign, custom games, and even an unfinished version of Forge mode, which was codenamed Bland at the time, are able to be accessed. When opening up the campaign selection, you'll be greeted with two options: Start New Campaign and Play Co-op. Each of these selections show a picture of various moments of the CR-117 mission. Interestingly enough, when looking at the co-op selections picture, it shows the Arbiter alongside Chief, but it appears that the Arbiter is still using his Halo 2 model as a placeholder. Selecting either of these options will take us to an unfinished campaign menu. Like the rest of the menus after this one, it uses a different background than the one seen in the final game. While it's still unfinished in terms of selections, it's pretty close to being done. The level select option doesn't have text on it, and when opening it up, due to the fact that the beta doesn't have campaign maps, there's nothing to select. Also, there's a fair amount of text strings that are still a work in progress, and that'll be a common sight throughout this overview. The custom games menu is also very close to being finalized, but not quite. When selecting which game mode to play, the only game type that's missing from the list is Infection. Then we have the Forge menu, which is codenamed Blam at this stage of development, and it was simply called Map Editor when you go into the game. When going to select the different network modes such as LAN or Xbox Live, hovering over the local option will show off a picture of the game what appears to be Halo 2 being played in the background. Going into the profile settings, you'll see the obviously different pictures being used for each selection, and a lot of what's here functions pretty much identically to what we have in the final game. However, during the time the Halo 3 beta went live in early 2007, we did not have access to different armor pieces. Thanks to Lord Zedd's Unlocker, however, we now have access to some of these armor permutations that were left over in the beta's files. While it may appear that there's nothing to select in the armor selection due to the fact that we have each string saying Blam, there's actually a total of 5 different variants to choose from, 4 of which go unused in the beta. Also, the Spartan used in the preview screen doesn't change its permutations according to what you have selected, which will eventually be a feature in the final game. As for the different armor sets, we have the standard Mark 6, the TQB set, the EVA set, the Recon set, and finally an unfinished variant of the EOD set, which goes untextured in the beta's files. Interestingly enough, the secondary colors used for the armor permutations besides the Mark 6 are painted on the armor differently than their final counterparts, with the secondary colors completely taking over most of the top half of the body. Now we'll finally jump into the gameplay aspects of the beta itself. Unlike the Halo 2 beta, the gameplay featured in this build is a lot closer to the finished product. Starting with the weapons, we'll begin with the iconic assault rifle. The charging handle on the assault rifle will move back and forth when firing the weapon in the beta. This no longer happens with the finished assault rifle in the final version of Halo 3. The shotgun's first-person animations are a little messed up in the beta. The Spartan's hands are supposed to move up and down with the shotgun when the player is walking, but the hand remains in a fixed position. This would eventually be fixed months later with the final release. The sniper rifle's contrails, which are the cloudy streams that appear when you shoot the weapon, are a lot more noticeable in the beta and remain on screen for a longer period of time than they do in the final game. Also, killing a player with the sniper rifle in a fashion that isn't a headshot will still grant the player a sniper kill medal. This was changed later on so that the medal would only be granted with a snipe to the head. The Spartan laser uses a very different targeting reticle in the beta. This one appears to be slightly lower res than its final counterpart, and the inner 4-line design that is shown in the beta was removed and replaced with a more circular design later on. Zooming in with the beta laser will extend the 4 lines to make a cross, whereas the final game's laser reticle shrinks the inner circle. Also in the beta, when charging the laser while zoomed in, you'll be able to see the red luminescence on the right hand side, when in the final game this isn't the case. The missile pod's firing animations aren't as enthusiastic in the beta, and almost look a bit incomplete, whereas in the final you can actually get an idea on how much oomph each missile pod shot has within the animation. The only difference I can find with the SMG was that it's slightly weaker in the beta, and that it kills a player with 25 bullets compared to its final version killing with only 23. The Spiker has a very small and hardly noticeable visual difference between the two versions of this game. Looking at the side of the weapon is a small light. The position that this light shines changed from the beta to the final. It's unknown as to why such a change was warranted on the Spiker in the first place. The Plasma Pistol's battery draining effect when charging the weapon was considerably slower in the beta, allowing the player to hold down the trigger with this weapon for a longer period of time. The Carbine was a stronger weapon in terms of kill times in the beta. It killed the player in 7 headshots as opposed to 8 like it does in the retail game, and it had a slightly faster rate of fire on top of that. This is one of the more famous weapon differences that many veterans of the Halo 3 beta experienced when they played it way back when. Lastly, for weapons, the Energy Sword behaved quite a bit differently in the beta than it does in the retail game. In the final version of Halo 3, the Energy Sword was given the ability to clash with another sword when both users would lunge at each other. This function was absent in the beta and it behaved much like its Halo 2 counterpart where the winner of the duel is randomized. Also, the sword still uses the Halo 2 version's weapon sounds. The equipment in the beta, which included the bubble shield, trip mine, and power drain, have some key differences as well. Each of these pieces of equipment are thrown without an animation, just jutting out of the player when they're used. Both the bubble shield and the power drain act the same way as they do in retail, but they both emit unused hazy particle effects that surround each sphere. The biggest and most notable change within the equipment was how the trip mine functioned. It was changed so much after the beta that it's almost not even the same piece of equipment anymore. In the Halo 3 beta, the trip mine had the ability to stick onto vehicles like a magnet, and its damage output was considerably higher as well, destroying vehicles like Warthogs and Banshees with one blast. All this was changed in the final game, where the trip mine can no longer one-shot light vehicles, and the magnetic ability is removed so that vehicles can no longer become death traps. The Ghost primary weapon had a much higher rate of fire in the beta than it does in retail. The boosting effect is also slightly different, appearing dimmer as well. The boosting controls on the Ghost also seem floatier in the beta, and the final's Ghost controls feel tighter and less drifty. The Banshee is mostly the same, but has a few alterations. When boosting in the final game, the screen zooms out just a hair and also has a fading effect on the edges of the screen. The screen also shakes quite noticeably when firing the Banshee's primary weapon. These traits are absent in the beta's Banshee. The Banshee's primary fire is slightly weaker in the beta, killing a player in 12 shots, while the retail Banshee manages to down a player in just 10. The Wraith in the beta has a couple of deviations compared to its retail counterpart. The lights that surround the Wraith are always turned on in the beta regardless if there's someone in the cockpit, whereas the retail Wraith has these lights turned off when it's unoccupied. The secondary plasma turret was also slightly stronger in the beta as well, killing a player in 12 shots, while the final game's turret has been slightly nerfed where it'll kill in 15 shots. The Mongoose is functionally the same in the beta. However, it lacks a horn unlike the final game version, and when driving it in the beta, the camera is slightly lower in it than in the final game. Not surprisingly, there's content within the beta's files that went unused during the time this went live. The anti-air wraith, for instance, behaves quite differently here. Overall, this version is considerably weaker and less viable than its retail counterpart. Its rate of fire is quite slow compared to its final version, firing fuel rods at about half of the speed. The lights on the back of the fuel rod turrets don't blink during sustained fire as well. The damage output of the beta version is severely weak, taking 6 shots to down a player. Whereas the final version only needs about 2. Here's 2 clips that demonstrate the quote-unquote destructive force of the beta anti-air wraith. Three other Warthog variants reside in the files as well. The Gauss Warthog in its current beta state is beyond overpowered. It has a much faster rate of fire than it does in the final game, with a firing rate similar to that of the Halo 2 version. The particle effects of the Goshawk are incomplete as well, and don't have that long bluish streak seen in the retail's Gauss shots. The Troop Transport Warthog also resides in the files, as well as a variant that was supposed to be used as an emergency medical service vehicle, transporting the wounded like an ambulance. This version actually appears in the final game's files as well, but still goes unused. The last bit of unused content that will be covered in this video is the Excavator, or in this case a highly unfinished Mauler. It has no textures, no firing sound, it uses the Plasma Pistol first person animations, and no reload animation. The weapon icon shows an entirely different model for this weapon. In fact, this very model was briefly seen in the Etu Brute Vidok, where it is held by a brute with one hand. The design itself took cues from one of the weapons that was going to make an appearance in Halo Combat Evolved. The damage itself seemed to be pretty comparable to the vinyl version of the Mauler, but thanks to not having a reload animation, the beta Mauler has a distinct advantage as it can just repeatedly fire until it runs out of ammo entirely. The map editor, which is the precursor to Forge, is obviously in a rough, unfinished state with many visual and functional differences. The monitors themselves are mostly finalized, but they lack the subtle bobbing animation that can be seen in the retail's monitors. Monitors in the beta don't have death animations just yet, and when they die, they'll leave behind an empty husk with no collision model, meaning a player can walk through the deceased Oracle. Switching from monitor to player can potentially be hazardous if you're low enough to the ground, as you'll have a chance to clip through the floor and fall to your death. This is due to the player switching at the exact spot where the monitor was located. This beta glitch can actually be exploited to reach certain areas that the developers did not intend for the player to go, such as the underground portions of Snowbound. Monitors even have the ability to flip vehicles in the beta. The crosshair when in monitor mode is a simple X shape. When hovering over a grabbable object, it will turn green and create 2 arrows on the side, indicating that the player is allowed to interact with the object. When grabbing hold of the object, the arrows will come together, signaling that the player is holding onto the forge piece. These arrows are the beta equivalent of the final game's hand icon, where it will be an open palm when it's ready to grab an object and a closed hand when the player is holding something. If an object is unable to be messed with, the crosshair will turn red. Each monitor has a small flashlight that will illuminate whatever is in front of it, but this will only work at a short distance. Each forgeable object in the game comes with an accompanying blue sphere. This is present in the final game, but the design of it in the beta is different. Where the sphere is more transparent, it shows some triangles on the inside. Some of the maps have a bugged budget scoreboard on the bottom right of the screen. This is due to said budget not functioning at all on the map. The only map that has a working budget limit is Snowbound. The Forge menu has an element that goes unused in the final game in the form of the preview box at the top. This would have probably shown either an icon or a full-blown picture of the item that the player hovers over when in the menu. Also, the maps within the beta have different kinds of items. In Valhalla's case, it has no items at all, whereas High Ground has exclusive access to forgeable energy swords and the only scenery object within the beta, which is the Forerunner fusion coil. The Banshee can be spawned in Snowbound in the beta, whereas the final version has it removed. Also within the beta, a player is able to rapidly spawn objects by spamming the A button. When doing this with bigger objects like Warthogs, the frame rate will start to choke up and particle effects will become weaker as the level becomes overloaded. If the monitor is close enough to the ground and spawns a weapon, for instance, it'll fall through the ground. When playing Forge and Split Screen, each player's Forge menu defaults to being shown on the entire screen as if it's being played with only one player, and both menus will combine and overlap with each other. When another player is driving a vehicle and a monitor picks that vehicle up, the player driving the vehicle will remain inside it as opposed to being ejected from it like in the final game. Lastly, certain special objects on the map can be picked up in the beta unlike in the retail game, such as the auto turrets on Snowbound and the various vehicle pads that hold either the Mongoose or the Warthog. Theater mode is a bit wonky in the beta. Some of the features, such as screenshots and clip recording, don't work in this offline version of the beta as it's not connected to any servers. Also, FreeCam doesn't work properly either. It only slightly backs away from the player in third person and doesn't allow the player to deviate from the Spartan's location in nearly any way. There are some miscellaneous aspects of the Halo 3 beta that I'd like to cover as well. Weapon lowering works just like how it does in the retail version of the game, but when viewed in first person, the weapon remains on screen instead of physically lowering like it does in the final. Jumping looks weird. And the far away sound effects for explosions are absent in the beta version of Halo 3. The main menu shows off an earlier version of Valhalla than the one that we have in the beta. The destroyed trees that were seen from the alpha footage of Halo 3 make a return here. One last aspect of the beta that is pretty significant, while we're on the subject of Valhalla, are the cliffside spawning areas at each base. In the beta, the platforms that the players spawn on top of are raised much higher, and were lowered in the retail version of the game. This was most likely due to two factors. One, it was easy to grab a sniper rifle and remain virtually unseen in this elevated position, and on the blue side, it's possible to grenade jump onto a higher section of the cliff. After a long tour of the beta, we move on to the Halo 3 Epsilon, the build that's infamous for getting a player's gamertag and console permabanned when he or she illegally downloaded it before Halo 3's launch. This build of the game is practically final, with the exception of there being Savo Highway as the only playable campaign mission, as well as only 5 multiplayer maps to play, which are Snowbound, Valhalla, High Ground, Last Resort, and Sand Trap. As this was the final test build before Halo 3 would eventually go gold, there's virtually no differences between this and the released version of Halo 3, with the exception of one solitary thing that I was able to spot in the multiplayer portion of this Epsilon build. As I said earlier in the video, I mentioned to keep the compass seen in one of the alpha screenshots of the game in your minds. Miraculously, it makes a return in the Epsilon build, of all things. This would eventually be recut from the game entirely and no longer appear in the final version of Halo 3. And that's it for this sizable beast of a video. If, and only if, you enjoyed what you saw today, hit the like button and subscribe for more Halo exclusive content from this channel. Also, I'd like to give a huge shout out to GameShoot13 for assisting me with this video by providing me some of the tools necessary to showcase everything I wanted to demonstrate in this video, such as getting the anti-air wraith and unfinished Muller to spawn in the beta. If you haven't already, please subscribe to him. His channel is amazing and has stellar Halo modding content. This is the Vengeful Vadim, and I'll see you on the great journey.